Let's talk about the way avoidantly attached people use sex. And I want you to really lean in here because this isn't what we usually think about when we think of intimacy. You see, for most people, sex is supposed to be this ultimate act of closeness, of connection. But for avoidance, it can actually be the opposite. Sex becomes a safe substitute for vulnerability, not a vehicle for it. Sounds counterintuitive, right? But when you understand the psychology behind it, it makes perfect sense. Avoidantly attached individuals fear emotional intimacy. They were wired somewhere along the way, usually through early experiences of emotional inconsistency, neglect, or overparenting, to believe that closeness equals risk. That if you open up, you'll be rejected, engulfed, or lose yourself. So what do? They find ways to connect that feel safer, more contained. And sex, the physical act, becomes a brilliant workaround. Here's why. Sex offers the illusion of closeness without the actual requirements of being emotionally open. It's a controlled environment. There's a script. There are roles. You can perform it, excel at it, enjoy it, and still keep your inner world sealed off. And for someone who is avoidant, that control is everything. It lets them feel connected just enough to satisfy the basic human need for touch, for validation, for momentary intimacy, without having to risk the terrifying unknown of true emotional exposure. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, but isn't sex vulnerable by nature? Yes, for some people. For people with secure attachment styles, for example, sex can be a profound emotional experience, but for avoidance, vulnerability is not tied to physical nakedness. It's tied to emotional access. And in their world, emotional access is dangerous, so they compartmentalize. They give their bodies, but not their hearts. They show up in bed, but not in the conversation afterward. And because they're often so good at the physical, so engaging, so present in the act, their partners can get tricked into thinking the connection is deeper than it is. But let me be clear, this isn't manipulative. It's not malicious. It's protective. Avoidants aren't using sex to deceive. They're using it to survive. It's how they bond without violating the internal rules that tell them to stay safe by staying distant. It's how they scratch the itch of connection without feeling like they're losing control. Now, philosophically speaking, this speaks to something deeper about the human condition. We are meaning-making creatures. We seek connection, we crave it, but we also fear annihilation through it. And avoidants, more than anyone else, live at that tension point. They want intimacy, but they fear it will cost them their independence, their identity, their safety. So sex becomes a kind of symbolic dance. Close but not too close, real but not too real. You get the touch, the chemistry, the moment, but not the aftercare, not the emotional glue that turns sex into bonding. Let's bring this down to real life. Have you ever known someone who's amazing in bed, passionate, responsive, even affectionate, but the second the clothes are back on, they're emotionally cold, withdrawn, or suddenly busy? That's not by accident. That's the avoidant strategy in action. And if you're on the receiving end of it, it can be incredibly confusing. You start to question your worth. You wonder why you feel so connected during sex, but so alone afterward. But understanding this pattern isn't just about decoding someone else. It's about gaining the awareness to break our own cycles too. Because let's be honest, many of us are drawn to avoidance. We think we can crack them. We think if the sex is good enough, consistent enough, emotional safety will magically follow. It won't, because for an avoidant, sex is the safe part. The emotional follow through, that's the real risk. And until they recognize that and choose to lean into that discomfort, the cycle repeats. So what does this mean for them and for us? It means we have to start seeing sex not as the pinnacle of connection, but as one tool among many. And if we're using it as the only tool, or worse, as a shield, we're not actually connecting. We're performing, we're sedating, we're self-protecting. True intimacy begins when you drop the performance and stay present after the climax. When you allow the vulnerability to continue after the physical act is over. So the next time you think about what it means to be intimate, I want you to ask yourself, am I using this moment to truly connect or to avoid something deeper? Because if we keep mistaking sex for bonding, we'll keep ending up in relationships that feel hot in the moment, but cold in the aftermath. And here's the truth that every avoidant and every person who loves one needs to hear. Sex without emotional safety is a transaction, not a transformation. If we want more than that, we have to be willing to go beyond the performance and into the real, raw messiness of connection. That's where the true bonding begins. If you're ready to stop settling and start rising in love, give this video a like. It tells me you're ready for the next level. Share your insights in the comments below. This is a space for bold, empowered women, and I'd love to hear your voice. And if you're serious about transforming your love life, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a chance to rise higher. So let's dig into something that confuses almost everyone who's been in a relationship with an avoidantly attached person: the sudden emotional shutdown after sex. It's confusing. It feels personal. You go from what seems like genuine closeness, deep eye contact, physical connection, warmth, to ice-cold distance. You're lying in bed wondering, did I imagine that moment? Was I the only one feeling something? No, you didn't imagine it. What you're witnessing is the avoidant paradox, the psychological snapback that happens after intimacy. And here's why it's so important to understand this. It has nothing to do with how attractive, lovable, or worthy you are. This is about how avoidants are wired to protect themselves once connection becomes too real. You have to understand, for someone with avoidant attachment, emotional closeness doesn't feel soothing. It feels dangerous. Think of it like this. Imagine connection as a heat source. For securely attached people, warmth is welcome. They move toward it. For avoidance, it's like standing too close to a fire. There's this initial pull, yes, but then the internal alarm bells start going off. Get back. You're too close. You might get burned. So what happens right after sex, which is a naturally bonding experience for most people, is avoidance retreat. Not because they don't care, not because they're playing games, but because they've reached their limit for closeness. They've crossed an invisible threshold. The one where emotional risk kicks in and their nervous system reacts by shutting down. Now, from a psychological perspective, this makes perfect sense. If you grew up in an environment where emotional availability wasn't consistent or safe, maybe your caregivers were distant, unpredictable, or overwhelmed, then your brain learned to regulate that pain by turning away from closeness, not toward it. You learned to soothe yourself through distance. Independence became your protection. Emotional needs, too risky. So as an adult, when someone gets too close, even in a healthy way, your instincts kick in and say, nope, too much, shut it down. Sex complicates this. Because during the act, oxytocin is released. That's the bonding hormone. It makes you feel safe, connected, even loved in the moment. But for avoidance, that temporary closeness can trigger the exact fear they've worked so hard to avoid. It's not that the feeling wasn't real. It's that the aftermath feels like a threat to their emotional control. So you see this pattern: intense closeness followed by emotional distance, physical passion followed by withdrawal. They might leave right after, go silent, get distracted, pull away emotionally. And if you don't understand what's happening, it can feel like rejection, but it's actually self-protection. Philosophically, this speaks to a core human dilemma. We want to be known, but we're terrified of being seen, especially if we've convinced ourselves that our vulnerability is dangerous. Avoidance, fear being seen in their emotional truth, because that truth, the fear, the need, the longing, is what they've spent a lifetime hiding. So when someone gets close enough to stir that up, they retreat, not because they don't feel something, but because they feel too much and they're not sure how to hold it. Now, let me be very clear here. Understanding this behavior does not excuse it. It doesn't mean you have to tolerate emotional whiplash or accept being pulled close only to be pushed away. But it does help you stop taking it personally. It helps you understand the internal war that avoidants are fighting, a war between the desire for connection and the terror of losing control. If you are the avoidant in this dynamic, I want you to hear this loud and clear. Pulling away after intimacy isn't protecting you. It's isolating you. And more than that, it's keeping you stuck. Because the very thing you're running from, being seen, being known, being emotionally held, is the thing you actually long for that moment right after sex. When your guard is down and you feel exposed. That's the exact moment where healing can begin. If you can stay present just for a few minutes longer, just long enough to notice the urge to run and choose not to. And if you're someone who loves an avoidant, your job is not to chase, fix, or earn their closeness. It's to hold your own emotional boundary with clarity, to recognize that their retreat isn't about you, and also that you deserve consistent emotional presence, not just flashes of it. What we're really talking about here is emotional capacity. Avoidants don't lack the desire to connect. They lack the capacity to stay in connection once it gets real. But capacity can grow. Awareness creates space, and every time an avoidant notices that pull to disconnect and stays just 1 second longer, they stretch their window of tolerance. That's how healing happens. Not overnight, but moment by moment. So the next time you find yourself on either side of this pattern, pulling away or watching someone else do it, ask yourself this: what if I stayed just 1 moment longer? What might open up in the space I've always rushed to close? Because real intimacy doesn't happen in the act. It happens in the aftermath. And if we can learn to stay even when it's uncomfortable, that's where the real transformation begins. Take a moment to reflect. Did something shift for you today? If so, go ahead and like this video. Let's affirm the growth together. Drop a comment below with your biggest insight. I'd love to hear how this message lands for you. And if you're feeling called to keep doing this work, to grow, heal, and attract the love you deserve, hit subscribe and we'll keep rising together, week by week. Let's get real about something most people don't talk about. The way sex becomes a stand-in for self-worth, especially for people with avoidant attachment. If you've ever been with someone who seems emotionally distant but sexually engaged, if they light up during intimacy but shut down afterward, you're not imagining it. What you're seeing is a coping strategy, not just for connection, but for validation. Here's the deal. Avoidantly attached individuals often carry a deep internalized belief: I am only safe or lovable when I'm in control. Vulnerability, that's dangerous. Needing someone, that feels like weakness. So instead of showing you their fears, their hopes, or their emotional needs, they show you something else: their performance, their skill, their sexuality. Why? Because that's an arena where they feel competent, where they can prove their worth without having to reveal their truth. Let's break this down psychologically. Avoidants didn't just wake up one day afraid of closeness. They learned it often from childhood environments that made emotional openness feel unsafe, inconsistent, or invisible. Maybe they were shamed for needing comfort. Maybe they were told to get over it when they were hurt. Maybe they were rewarded for being independent, self-sufficient, low maintenance, and so they adapted. They shut down the part of themselves that needed emotional reassurance and learned to source validation elsewhere. And for many avoidants, that elsewhere becomes sex. Because let's be honest, sex is one of the fastest, most culturally reinforced ways to feel worthy. You get praise, you get attention. You feel wanted, even desired. And in that moment, in that performance, you don't have to show who you really are. You don't have to say what you're afraid of. You don't have to admit that you want to be chosen, held, seen. You just have to be. And for someone who's learned to equate emotional invisibility with safety, being good at sex becomes a powerful and addictive way to feel like enough. But here's where it gets tricky. Because sex for avoidance doesn't just serve as a pathway to connection. It becomes a mask. A mask that says, I'm okay as long as you want me physically. I'm in control as long as I don't let you see what's underneath. And the tragedy is that underneath that performance is often someone who's starving. Not for touch, but for real emotional intimacy, for closeness that isn't earned through performance, but given freely. That kind of connection is terrifying because it requires authenticity, not achievement. Let me give you an example. Maybe you've been in a situationship. You have amazing chemistry. The sex is intense. The energy is addictive. But every time you try to talk about feelings or define the relationship, they go quiet, get distant, maybe even make you feel like you're asking for too much. That's not because they don't feel anything. It's because you're entering territory they don't know how to navigate. They're fluent in seduction. They're fluent in physical closeness. But emotional transparency, that's a language they never learned or were punished for trying to speak. This is why, after sex, avoidants often feel anxious even if they don't show it. Because in that moment of closeness, something real almost surfaced. And if you responded warmly, if you saw something in them, that's when the panic starts. Did they see too much? Am I still in control? The validation they got from being wanted starts to fade, and the emotional risk starts to rise. So they pull away, they create distance, and maybe they seek another encounter with you or someone else to get that hit of validation again without the emotional strings attached. Now here's the hard truth. When sex becomes the primary or only way to feel worthy, it turns intimacy into performance art. You're not connecting, you're auditioning. And no matter how good the performance is, it won't fill the hole left by emotional disconnection. Because sex can affirm your desirability, but it can't answer the question, do you see me and love me beyond what I give you? That's the question. Avoidants are afraid to ask. That's the question they've spent years avoiding. Because what if the answer is no? What if without the performance, they're not enough? But here's the opportunity and the turning point. When an avoidant starts to notice that they're using sex to regulate their sense of worth, when they realize that post-sex emotional distance isn't freedom, it's fear, they can choose something different. They can practice staying. They can risk showing something real, even if it's messy, even if it's awkward, because only then do they start building self-worth from the inside out, not from external validation. And if you're in a relationship with someone like this, you don't have to accept scraps of intimacy disguised as passion. You can love them without rescuing them. You can hold space for their growth and honor your own need for emotional reciprocity. Because in the end, here's what it comes down to. Your worth isn't measured by how desirable you are. It's measured by how deeply you're willing to be known. And for avoidance, that shift from sex as validation to intimacy as truth is the beginning of everything real. If this message touched something in your heart today, I'd love for you to hit the like button. It lets me know you're here growing with me. And leave a comment. I read them all, and your reflections inspire me. Don't forget to subscribe because this is just the beginning of your love story, and we're going to keep walking this path together. Let's talk about what avoidants often find so attractive about sex. And it's not just the physicality or the validation or even the momentary closeness. It's the simplicity, the structure, the silence, because here's the truth. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, sex is one of the few forms of intimacy that doesn't demand emotional negotiation. There's no need to explain yourself, No need to sit in the discomfort of difficult conversations. No need to navigate vulnerability with words. It's all action, all instinct. And for people who find emotional intimacy overwhelming, that's a huge relief. When you think about intimacy in a relationship, real intimacy, it involves effort. It involves navigating another person's needs, being honest about your own, and most of all, sitting in spaces of emotional ambiguity. That's hard for anyone, but for avoidance, it can feel like standing at the edge of a cliff. They didn't grow up learning that their emotional world was welcome, understood, or safe. So when someone wants to talk, really talk, they don't lean in. They look for the nearest exit. And this is where sex becomes the perfect workaround. Because sex doesn't require a backstory. It doesn't require emotional transparency. You don't need to explain why you're distant, or what triggered you, or why you're afraid to commit. You can just do. And for someone who equates emotional openness with danger, this can feel like the safest form of intimacy there is. Not because it's deep, but because it's quiet. Now, I want to be clear here. Sex isn't shallow. Sex can be emotionally profound. But when it's used to avoid emotional negotiation, when it becomes a shortcut, that's when it stops being a bridge to connection and becomes a wall, a distraction, a way of saying, let's be close, but let's not talk about what that really means. Avoidants are often highly intelligent, introspective people. They're not incapable of emotional depth, far from it. But when you've spent your whole life learning that feelings complicate things, that talking about needs leads to rejection or conflict, you develop coping strategies. You avoid the conversations that make you feel weak. You tell yourself that it's better to keep the peace, to keep things light, to just move on, and sex becomes the ultimate escape hatch. You get to feel something without saying anything. But here's the cost. When emotional negotiation is consistently avoided, relationships stay surface level. You never really resolve conflict. You just pause it. You don't get to build trust because trust requires communication. And more than anything, you don't get to feel truly known because being known requires words, honesty, the messiness of saying, here's what I'm struggling with, or I felt hurt when you said that, or I'm scared to need you. That's emotional maturity. And you can't bypass it with physicality. Philosophically, this taps into something deeper about human nature. We are wired to seek coherence between what we do, what we say, and what we feel. And when those things are out of sync, when we're having sex but not having conversations, when we're touching but not talking, we feel that incoherence. Even if we can't name it, it shows up in the unease after intimacy, in the unanswered questions, in the nagging sense that something's missing even if everything looks fine on the outside. That's why so many relationships with avoidant dynamics feel like emotional limbo. You're physically close, but you're emotionally stuck. You keep going back to the connection, the chemistry, hoping this time will be different. But until the underlying avoidance is addressed, nothing changes. Because you can't build a relationship on avoidance. You can't replace emotional work with physical rhythm and expect long-term closeness to emerge. You just can't. Now, if you're the avoidant in this equation, I want you to know this isn't your fault. Your attachment style was formed before you had a say in it, but it is your responsibility now, and avoiding hard conversations doesn't protect you. It delays the kind of intimacy you actually crave. Yes, emotional negotiation is hard. It requires courage, clarity, and practice, but avoiding it isn't safety, it's stagnation. And if you're in love with someone who avoids emotional negotiation, someone who leans into sex, but pulls away when things get real, your job isn't to beg for communication. Your job is to decide whether this dynamic aligns with your emotional needs. Because you deserve a relationship where talking is as safe as touching, where being heard matters just as much as being desired. So what do you do with all this? You start by noticing the patterns. You name what's happening gently, honestly. You build the muscle of staying in the conversation even when your instinct is to escape. You practice saying what's true even when your voice shakes. That's how we unlearn avoidance, not all at once, but one honest moment at a time. Because here's what it all comes down to. Real intimacy begins when you stop using sex to silence your truth and start using your voice to build something real. And the moment you choose conversation over performance, that's the moment everything starts to shift. If you're ready to stop settling and start rising in love, give this video a like. It tells me you're ready for the next level. Share your insights in the comments below. This is a space for bold, empowered women, and I'd love to hear your voice. And if you're serious about transforming your love life, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a chance to rise higher. Now, here's where things get even more layered, because avoidants aren't just using sex to dodge emotional conversations or validate their worth. They're also using it to simulate connection, to give themselves, and often you, the illusion of closeness without actually stepping into the vulnerability that real intimacy demands. And I say illusion not because the connection isn't felt in the moment, it is. That's part of what makes it so confusing. In the moment during sex, there's presence, there's touch, maybe even tenderness. You might feel seen, wanted, chosen, but what you're often not getting, and this is where things start to crack, is the emotional consistency that tells you this is safe, this is solid, this is growing. For the avoidant, sex becomes a shortcut. It looks like connection, it feels like closeness, but it's missing the foundation. Think of it like building a house with no frame, just furniture, rugs, and candles arranged to look like a home. But when the emotional winds blow, when conflict shows up, when someone asks for more, when reality presses in, that structure collapses because it was never built to hold anything long term. Let's talk about why this illusion works so well, especially for avoidants. They're not trying to trick you. They're trying to protect themselves. And in their world, sex is a safer way to experience connection. It's time-bound. It starts and ends. It's physical, not emotional. There's a script, a beginning, a climax, a resolution. Most importantly, it doesn't ask for future promises. There's no contract that says, now that we've connected physically, we must grow together emotionally. Sex creates a temporary sense of togetherness that doesn't require the long-term vulnerability avoidants are wired to fear. But the problem is this: temporary connection without emotional depth eventually creates emotional confusion. You start asking questions like, if they're so physically present with me, why do they feel so emotionally absent? Why does it feel like we're close, but I still don't know where I stand? Or even worse, why do I feel lonelier with them than when I'm alone? This is the fallout of mistaking sex for connection. When someone is emotionally avoidant, they're often brilliant at delivering moments of intensity without ever actually building intimacy. And to the person on the receiving end, especially if you're anxiously attached, it can feel like emotional whiplash. One moment you're intertwined, the next they're emotionally gone, and you're left wondering, was it even real? Here's the hard truth. It was real for that moment, but real isn't the same as sustainable. Because true connection isn't just about intensity, it's about continuity. It's about whether the person who is close to you in the heat of the moment can also be close to you in the mundane, the messy, the uncomfortable. And that's what avoidants often struggle with: continuity. Because emotional consistency requires showing up. It requires revealing parts of yourself that don't feel polished or performative. And for someone who's spent a lifetime surviving by staying self-contained, that's terrifying. So instead, they offer fragments, they offer chemistry, they offer sex. And if you're not paying attention, it can look and feel like a relationship until you realize you're the only one emotionally holding it up. This is why emotional responsibility matters, not just for avoidance, but for all of us. We have to stop letting moments trick us into believing they're foundations. Just because someone shows up physically doesn't mean they're available emotionally. Just because you feel connected in bed doesn't mean you're building something that lasts. And if you're the avoidant, if you recognize yourself in this, hear me when I say this. You're not broken. You're not incapable of connection. You're just afraid, and that fear makes sense, because connection requires being seen, not just when you're desirable, but when you're difficult, when you're unsure, when you don't have the answers. Sex can't carry that kind of weight. It's too light, too fleeting. It's a spark, not a structure. And the life you want, the real, lasting, anchored life, is built with more than sparks. It's built with presence, with communication, with earned trust. So what's the shift? It's learning to pause, to ask, am I using this moment to connect or to hide? It's being honest about what sex has been doing in your relationships. Has it been a bridge or a mask? Has it deepened your bond or delayed your truth? Because here's the bottom line, sex might mimic connection, but only vulnerability builds it. And if you're ready to stop chasing sparks and start building something solid, it starts with the courage to show up differently. Not just in bed, but in the brave, uncomfortable, transformative space of being known. Take a moment to reflect. Did something shift for you today? If so, go ahead and like this video. Let's affirm the growth together. Drop a comment below with your biggest insight. I'd love to hear how this message lands for you. And if you're feeling called to keep doing this work to grow, heal, and attract the love you deserve, hit subscribe, and we'll keep rising together.